So, good morning, buenos días, bon dia. Welcome to our third and last panel. Yesterday afternoon we focused on the European Court of Human Rights. Now we are shifting our attention to the Court of Justice of the European Union. And for that purpose, we have an excellent panel with leading experts in the field. So first, Matteo Bonelli, who's professor of European law at Maastricht University, will give a presentation on the EU against populism from a reactive to a proactive approach. Then Giuseppe Martinico, professor of comparative public law at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa, will speak on the populist mobilization of national constitutional law against the primacy of EU law. And after the break, we'll have Eleanor Sharpston, honorary professor at Edinburgh University and former Advocate General at the Court of Justice of the European Union. So we are very happy to have you all here and very honored too. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And please, Matteo, whenever you're ready, you have the floor.
Yes, thanks a lot. Do you have a pointer about that?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. No worries.
Put your slides on.
Yes, so, well, first of all, thanks, Aida, thanks, Joan, thanks to the team for the invitation. It's wonderful to be back in Barcelona at this wonderful university, in this wonderful city. So what I want to do today, and what I was asked to do today, is to discuss the EU against populism, and how I have tried to frame this is to present how the EU's strategy against populism has changed to a large extent from an essentially reactive approach to what I define, also the institutions have defined it at times as a proactive approach. I will explain a bit more what I mean with that in the next minutes. And this is what I want to do. In fact, I want to start with, the very idea of the EU against populism, and in fact with a question mark, as I will explain in a second, show what the reactive approach briefly is, or was and still is, before moving to the proactive approach. And I want to focus in particular on three dimensions of what I define the proactive approach. So the monitoring of national constitutional systems, forms of conditionality, which are somewhere in between reactive and proactive approach. And then maybe to say something more, in fact, on the third of these elements of the proactive approach, namely the use of legislation to promote and protect EU values, and also to fight populism to some extent. To reflect on the impact of this proactive approach, what is this proactive approach changing, and then to maybe conclude, also to follow up on some of the reflections we had yesterday on whether in fact the EU is really still acting against populism, or to what extent we see also forms of adaptation or accommodation of populist claims. Now, the starting point is maybe, is a necessary and perhaps even obvious premise that EU institutions have never explicitly targeted populism as a constitutional, I would even say a political problem. This is not uncommon to the EU. I think we have similar approaches also in the Council of Europe system, as we discussed yesterday in one of those judgments that we discussed yesterday. We truly saw the court engaging, the European Court of Human Rights, with populism as targeting populism per se, but also in many national constitutional systems. Now, we don't see in any EU document a definition of populism, and even beyond that, we see virtually no reference to populism or populist or populists in EU legislation, not even in policy documents. And I have looked, in fact, at several policy documents in preparing this talk. For example, even in more political documents, such as State of the Union speeches by Commission President von der Leyen, and even before that, Commission President Juncker, we don't see references to populist and populism, even when the president is describing democratic challenges. And we don't have references to populism also in documents which are part of the strategy to protect the rule of law, to protect democracy and fundamental rights. Similarly, populist and populism are not present in the Court of Justice case law. There are a couple of references, really, but in a couple of advocate general opinions, but very little, really. I don't think we can speak, therefore, of a true EU anti-populism or anti-populist strategy. In fact, depending on the definition of populism that we adopt, populists have been in power and are in power in many member states in different phases. So in different member states, sometimes populists have been in power, then out of power, then came back to power. And this has never been per se a EU concern, I would say. We see today that, again, depending on how we define populism, some populists are in governments in both in Western and Central and Eastern Europe, but this is not per se a EU problem, a EU concern. Now, yet, of course, there was the presentation. I would stop here to some extent. The institutions are not oblivious, I would say, to populism challenges, and we can, I think, meaningfully talk of the EU against populism. Now, the core frame and trigger for EU intervention against populism has been, I would claim, the negative impact of populism on the values of Article 2 TEU. So the EU anti-populist strategy, which is not there in name, has been always framed around the values of Article 2. First, more indirectly, and then more and more directly, with the court especially playing a crucial role in translating what are the underlying political challenges of populism into what I would define as legal constitutional challenges. So the court, as we know, has unlocked the use of EU instruments, such as the infringement procedure, to tackle the negative effects of populism on constitutional values. It has defined standards, for example, as we discussed already yesterday, in terms of judicial independence. And more we see also political institutions then working together with the court in translating those challenges into, those political challenges into legal and constitutional ones. Now, as we know, these values are also today presented by the court, but also by the political institution as the very identity of the union legal order. So the court has not yet used the language of constitutional identity stricto sensu, but has spoken of those values as forming part of the very identity of the legal order. The legal order is then described in constitutional terms, in judgments such as the conditionality judgments, more recently by Advocate General Chapeta in the infringement case on the values of the Union against Hungary, so les valeurs de l'Union. Now, let me go briefly back to the reactive approach, and then I will say something more on the proactive approach. Now, briefly, in the early days, in the very early days, the focus of EU institutions, the court and the commission essentially, was, I would say, the impact of populism on compliance with substantive provisions, bless you, of EU law. The most representative case is a very well-known case in which I will not go back, the case that the Commission launched against Hungary on the question of the age of retirement of judges. The question was never the age of retirement per se, but it was a problem of judicial independence, which, however, the Commission and the Court framed as an issue of, in fact, EU age discrimination law, anti-discrimination law, and the case was only tackled from that perspective. So populism led to institutional changes, which were, however, translated into compliance with EU secondary legislation in that case. And we have, of course, several more examples of that. Also, for example, in some internal market cases that also relate to Hungary, where, again, this populist narrative is essentially not part. So it might be the political reason for the breach of EU law, but this is not the frame through which the court and the commission address it. Later, and in fact we discussed this yesterday, the focus shifted on the protection of independent institutions, crucially courts, national courts, from populist attacks. So from substantive EU law to a focus on institutions. And we see, in fact, several mechanisms, reactive mechanisms were used, so the rule of law framework in Poland, the judicial independence cases against Poland or brought by Polish courts, but also the activation of Article 7.1, all essentially a reaction to populist undermining of national institutions. And essentially, in fact, one type of institution, national courts. Now, next to it, and more occasionally, I would say, the Commission has also protected charter rights, and the court have also protected charter rights via infringement actions. So we have, in fact, only a couple of cases. The most notable ones are 2 cases against Hungary on transparency of associations. This was the anti-NGO law that Hungary adopted around 2016-17, and the higher education case, which concerned, in fact, the Central European University. So essentially what we saw in this first phase was that the EU institutions, essentially the Commission, but also the political actor to some extent, and therefore the court, waited until the case became, until populists produced effects on EU structures, and there it intervenes. So indeed, the EU only intervened, and I mean, the court is essentially a reactive institution, of course. Populists produce concrete legal effects, and then the EU could intervene. Now, I would define this approach as, first of all, effects-oriented, so in a sense that populism was tackled when it produced effects on certain constitutional structures, but also on compliance with EU law. Institutions-oriented, again, the focus was the protection of independent institutions, and focused also on crisis. So it was an approach that essentially focused on instances in which there was already a threat or a breach of EU law, and there the EU stepped in. In this first phase, the focus was also essentially, if we unpack the values of Article 2, on one of those values, the rule of law, and to much lesser extent on human rights. So among the values of Article 2. And really the key player also in shaping the agenda was the Court of Justice, with judgments such as the Portuguese judges' cases or the judgments in the Supreme Court case in Poland, supported by the Commission and also by the still independent national courts, especially in Poland. Now, this approach is, to be clear, still there. We still see it in cases such as the very relevant infringement action against Hungary, which for the first time activates Article 2. But it is increasingly complemented by also proactive strategies, which I want to describe in the next minutes. And this has happened in particular since the first von der Leyen Commission came in power in around 2019, 2020. And again, I want to show in particular 3 dimensions or 3 aspects of this proactive approach. The first is the more systematic monitoring of member states' constitutional systems. The second is the use of EU funding and funding conditionality to curb and also to prevent populism in some senses. And then I want to say something more, as I mentioned earlier, on values protecting and values promoting legislation. Now, let me be brief on the first aspects of the proactive approach, which is the monitoring dimension. So as we, I assume, all know, since 2020, the Commission produces annual rule of law reports for all 27 member states, and it has now also included candidate countries in those rule of law reports, in which it monitors 4 key components, 4 key aspects: justice systems, which is, again, a signal of continuity with what we saw before, anti-corruption frameworks, checks and balances issues, and this is also why it is involved there. The addition to the strategy, to the approach, is also a focus on media pluralism. So that also signals a rather broad interpretation of what rule of law means, which also encompasses other components of the values of Article 2. Now, in fact, we see, and I will return to this later, an approach that goes beyond crisis, so it's a much more horizontal approach, and tries to anticipate intervention, so tries to also function as an early warning for possible threats to constitutional, to the rule of law and to other values. and an approach which also feeds into and supports other processes, including budgetary conditionality. So the findings of the Commission on the Rule of Law reports and the recommendation the Commission issues under the Rule of Law reports are then embedded into other EU systems. What we see is also still an emphasis on, in fact, institutions, naturally, justice systems, anti-corruption frameworks, checks and balances, but also this expansion, as I mentioned, to media, which allows to capture new type of issues that don't relate so much on the effects necessarily of populism, but also on democratic processes. The second pillar of the proactive approach is the use of funding and funding conditionality. Now, of course, this is somewhere in between reaction and pro-action. And we see this notably with the budgetary conditionality regulation, which again, I suppose we very well know, which was adopted at the end of 2020, next to Next Generation EU and the multi-annual financial framework, and which has been, in fact, a bridge between these two approaches, because the budgetary conditional regulation still is a crisis tool which focuses, again, on the effects that populist politics and policies produce on institutions, including anti-corruption institutions, but also judicial institutions. But it is, of course, a mechanism where, well, the EU realized it needed to add a new dimension to the toolkit, which is applicable to everyone. So, in fact, the monitoring is there for everyone, also linked to the rule of law reports. So, a consolidation of the toolkit. The proactive dimension is perhaps even more evident in the further mainstreaming of conditionality, which already we mentioned in passing yesterday, in other funding tools. So in particular, we have seen forms of conditionality also in the Next Generation EU recovery plan, but also perhaps, and this is very remarkable, in the so-called Common Provisions Regulation that goes together with the multi-annual financial framework. We have seen the embedding of a charter-based conditionality, which has actually allowed the Commission to freeze the most significant amount of EU funding, both in the case of Hungary and in the case of Poland. Now, the way in which the charter conditionality in the common provision regulations operate is, in fact, ex ante. It does not need a breach of EU values, a breach of EU rights, to be activated, but in fact it demands member states to put in place an effective system to guarantee that the charter is adopted, that the charter is respected, that the charter is complied with in the implementation of EU funds. So it has also a preventing function, which goes together with a more reactive function. In the proposal, and Diane, I think, was hinting at it yesterday, on the new multi-annual financial framework, the Commission has also proposed a further strengthening of ex-ante rule of law and charter conditionality, which would go together still with the budgetary conditionality regulation, but in fact, they allow a much earlier type of intervention beyond broad systemic threats to the rule of law, and ask member states to embed in their implementation plans for the disbursement of EU funds sufficient guarantees that the rule of law and fundamental rights are complied with. Now, the proactive approach when we speak of EU funding is also very much evident in the fact that since 2021, with the current multi-annual financial framework, we have also specific funding dedicated to values protecting and values promoting programs. So the new Citizens, Equality, Rights and Values program was created with the MFF, and the Commission also envisages to maintain similar funding structures for the next MFF. So here we see also more evidently an approach that does not work for, is not meant for crisis, is not meant for only to limit the effects of populist politics or policies on values, but also, in fact, to promoting values in the member states and involve citizens and civil society. The third pillar of the approach is then the use of EU legislation, and this is also maybe what I find personally most interesting in the second part of, in this new strategy. And in 2020 and 2023, the Commission adopted two packages or plans of a series of legislative and flanking, also some non-legislative measures, on core democratic issues. Now, Many of those initiatives have already been, in fact, successfully adopted by institutions, and these are the cases for the first three of those initiatives. So the European Media Freedom Act, the Regulation on Political Advertising, and the Anti-SLAPP, Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation Directive. And still, what is still pending in the legislative process is a proposed directive on the transparency of interest representation. So what we see here is in fact, maybe a word on each of those, or at least a couple of those proposals. The European Media Freedom Act contains a series, in fact, is perhaps the most remarkable of those pieces of legislation. Through the internal market legal basis, the EU has adopted, in fact, a series of measures that protect and promote media freedom in the member states, also regulating the media markets, but also the relationship, let's say, between media and online platforms, so complementing also the activities that I also describe later in a second of the digital constitutional strategy, in which, well, I think the core attempt of the EU is to ensure an effective and well, not only effective media markets in economic terms, but also to, in fact, ensure sufficient media pluralism and guarantees of media independence in the member states. So the internal market objective goes together with, in fact, the core element of the proposal, which is the protection of media pluralism and freedom of information in the member states. There are rules on media concentration, the creation of new institutional structure, the European Board of Media Services, which promotes the enforcement of the regulation and, again, includes guarantees of independence. We see also in the transparency of political advertising an effort to guarantee that political advertising, both online and offline, is harmonized, and we have common standards of transparency. This, of course, has been inspired by, well, already back in the Brexit referendum debates, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but also the dissemination in general of political advertising especially on the web, in which the Commission tries again through an internal market legal basis to, or as the Commission, the institutions have adopted through an internal market legal basis, harmonized standards of transparency applicable to all providers of political advertising services. So this goes next to the, what also was already mentioned yesterday, the digital constitutional strategy, in particular through the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, in which, again, the EU tries to regulate the online space to guarantee public debates on the web. Now, next to these instruments, we also have a series of recommendations that the Commission has adopted both on media pluralism and also on, for example, free elections, civic engagement, and civic participation. And there is also a new European Democracy Shield in the making, which should be announced, in fact, in November by the Commission, in which the focus is mostly on the question of foreign interference, rather, right? So the foreign interference into European democratic processes. Now, what we see with this approach of this dimension of the legislative approach is the EU tries to set standards on fundamental aspects of national democratic processes. We see an attempt to protect pluralist structures of democratic debates, including free media. And we see here, in fact, a clear anti-populist flavor if populism is perceived as undermining and in fact, rejecting the pluralist structure and the pluralist nature of European democracies. And in fact, therefore, an intervention really on the tools used by populists rather than only focusing on the effects, there is a C missing, of populism, so including crucially digital platforms. So to shape democratic processes and not only focus on the aftermath of populist politics. What we see also, again, as I mentioned a second ago, is also the shielding of European democratic processes from what is described increasingly as foreign interference, which supports populist movements. Well, the key player in the sense is and was and still is Russia, of course. But in fact, to return to something I was saying at the beginning, the few times in which we see the word populism and populist being used in EU policy documents is in this specific context. So the fear that external players, third states, third countries support populist movements in the member states. And therefore, the EU tries to shield, let's say, democratic processes from foreign interference. So there is also a more distinct, in these cases, militant democracy flavor of EU intervention, as it's a more protective turn of the initiatives. Now, yes, I move towards the final part of the presentation. So, as I was saying, especially in EU legislation, the use of legislation to protect the values and to counter populism, we see a more direct confrontation with populist tools and practices. So that goes before, in fact, that acts before the anticipates intervention to before the outcomes, the effects of populism, but tries to anticipate and prevent intervention. So this is an approach which, instead of being oriented at the effects of populism, it focuses on processes. It shifts the emphasis from institutions to also citizens and civil society, and it's a much more horizontal approach. So not only oriented to crisis, but also focuses on prevention, but also on possibly the phase of rebuilding, as we were discussing yesterday. After populism, national democratic structures. What we see is a focus not only and not so much on rule of law and fundamental rights, but a more explicit emphasis on the value of democracy. So try to concretize the value of democracy, which, as I will say in a second, also prevents that populists can exploit, let's say, democracy against the rule of law, as might have happened in the early stages of EU intervention. The court is still there, of course, but political institutions are becoming much more central in EU action against populism. What I think needs still to be highlighted is that this intervention is still not framed as tackling populism as such. So none of the interventions are justified on the basis of the need to protect democracies against populism, but also always on the basis of different rationales. Now, what to make of it? I see this, in fact, as a significant step forward in EU action. So if populism, very simply, if populism is also a political phenomenon which produces consequences on constitutional structures, well, it is evident that it also requires a more political response by EU institutions, and it's entrusting only the court on the protection of values against populism cannot be the way forward. What I think it also does is to create a virtuous circle of legitimization between the courts and political institutions where the processes feed into each other. The Court of Justice elaborates standards on the rule of law, which are then welcomed and adopted by the EU legislator in, for example, the constitutionality regulation, and then in turn allows the court to further flesh out those standards. Of course, the creation of democratic standards would also probably allow in the near future the the court to further elaborate on democracy as a value in Article 2. And as I just said, I think it is also important that the EU institutions are ready today to talk also of democracy and not only of rule of law, because this takes out a possibility for populists, or removes the possibility for populists, in fact, to play democracy against the rule of law, to claim that they are, in fact, protecting and promoting a national vision of democracy against the Brussels rule of law. So the EU intervention is justified much more directly on a democratic basis and explicitly tries to protect national democratic processes in the member states. Of course, there are questions open, so I don't want to present this in a too optimistic fashion, and I think two evident questions are there. Now, the first is the competence that the EU has to really regulate domestic processes and to what extent the EU has the competence to do so. The European Media Freedom Act was challenged by Hungary before the Court of Justice. The case is still pending. And of course, what is remarkable here, that in order to adopt those democratic standards, the EU had to rely on the legal basis of 114, so the internal market legal basis. And in that sense, it is evident that it is stretching existing competences, but in the treaties, we do not have more explicit legal basis to perhaps do what I just described. There is also a risk that, in a sense, intervention might be too late where populists have already captured democratic institutions and domestic processes more generally, while at the same time been too much for others, where in fact countries have already been very effective in tackling and curbing populist and populism, then especially, for example, again in the case of the European Media Freedom Act, this has been claimed very often that regulation does too little for cases like Hungary, where media freedom, media issues are widespread, but it's too limiting of national competencies and national sovereignty, where media freedom, in fact, works very well already. I want to conclude also on a maybe not so optimistic note, and this is really my final point, and it's a bit of a reflection, a more, not so research-based, but more of a feeling-based observation, also based on what we were discussing yesterday, that we also see, I think, in the EU system, traces of accommodation of populism, or I think, again, Diane was yesterday calling adaptation. So we see policy areas where populist frames and claims are increasingly more central and more accepted. The two obvious examples are perhaps migration and asylum, but also we see traces of this in the climate and environment fields. And what is perhaps to be highlighted, that in the area of values protection, these populist frames and claims have not actually become more central. Those areas have been more insulated. But the question is, will also those areas be captured, start to accommodate also populist claims? We don't see this so far, but I think we would be too optimistic if we don't see a risk of, in fact, populist claims reaching those fields too. Now, of course, the court has so far seemed less vulnerable to populist than political institutions, and has tried to uphold and guarantee the values we were discussing. But of course, the court is also not immune from the broader political context, and perhaps more horizontally, as I just said, if populism is also a political problem, it will also require anyway a political solution. I'll conclude here because my time is up, and thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Matteo. Now, from the EU perspective, let's move to the constitutional law and constitutional court's reactions. Thank you.
Thanks indeed, Aida. Good morning, everyone. Many thanks, of course, to Johan, Alex, and Pompeo Fabra for involving me in this project, for this very kind invitation. I prepared the PowerPoint presentation to facilitate my talk, but I wouldn't need that, buddy. Thanks so much, Matteo. So let's see if this works. Yeah. Today I'm going to discuss a topic that lies in a way, I will say, midway between the focus of my recent work and the subject of a new book that I wrote with Dr. Pablo Castillo-Ortiz, and which will be published by OUP next year. The premise I would like to start with is that in recent years, the principle of primacy of EU law has ceased to be a purely technical notion discussed only among lawyers and judges. It has instead become a central element in European political debates. And indeed, we are witnessing what we are seeing is a sort of growing mobilization, and I'm gonna describe this term in a minute, referring, of course, to the very important book by Clifford Bob that was already mentioned yesterday by Paul Blocker. And we are indeed, seeing this kind of mobilization of national constitutional law against the principle of primacy of EU law, and the recent constitutional reform in Slovakia is only the latest example in this respect. As we know, last month the Slovak National Council approved the 23rd constitutional amendment, which inserted an explicit reference to national identity and introduced several provisions purportedly aimed at safeguarding the traditional family. Here is a rough translation. I struggled a bit, to locate the latest version of the amendment. And this is not the entire amendment. There are also other problematic parts that's affecting, for instance, the rights of the same-sex couples, for instance, that stand stating that in Slovak constitutional law there are only two sexes. But I wanted to, focus on this part of the amendment, which explicitly refers to national identity, and because of that, I underlined, I stressed some passages, and they will come back to this point very soon. So, in the months preceding the approval of this amendment, the Venice Commission issued an urgent opinion on the Slovak amendment, and similar concerns were raised by the EU Agency for Fundamental Rights. The Slovak amendment can be seen as a part of a broader identitarian turn that seems to characterize the current relationship between domestic and supranational laws. To consider, for instance, elements already present in the German federal constitutional court case law, for instance, the Lisbon Urteil, and more recently, the 7th Amendment to the Hungarian Basic Law in 2018. The latter introduced the new article, letter R.4, stating that, I'm quoting, the protection of the constitutional identity and Christian culture of Hungary shall be an obligation of every organ of the state. Now, a caveat, I know that EU lawyers normally distinguish between constitutional identity and national identity. Pablo has written an amazing book, but my point is that in practice, especially at national level, these two formulae are used in an interchangeable manner. So, bear will be made, but this is what comparative law suggests. So what is particularly interesting and in a way paradoxical is that these liberal populist forces employ a vocabulary that originates within EU law itself. After all, Article 4.2 speaks of a respect for the national identities of member states, but even earlier, for instance, at the time of the Maastricht Treaty, we saw similar moves. For instance, to consider the Article F of the treaty, and to consider the introduction of the Grogan Protocol, which ensured that nothing in the treaties could affect Article 40.3 of the Irish Constitution, a provision stating that the unborn child had the right to life. So the Grogan Protocol is very interesting because the latest part of this Slovak amendment resembles the wording of the Grogan Protocol. So all these developments show that we are facing not only a legal challenge, but a political strategy. Indeed, recently this approach has spread, and this can be seen also looking at the manifestos of some political parties. If you look at the 2018 Lega manifesto, you will see that there they openly rejected the primacy of EU law in the name of constitutional supremacy. Later, once in power, Lega is now part of the Meloni government, they proposed the constitutional bill aimed at limiting the domestic effects of EU law primacy. But something similar happens elsewhere as well. In France, Marine Le Pen proposed some referenda to recognize the prevalence of national law over EU law, and even Michel Barnier, the chief negotiator of Brexit, publicly suggested revisiting the principle of primacy in 2021. Okay, so this phenomenon can be studied from at least 3 different perspectives. From the viewpoint of this identity turn, within EU law itself, and this is what Vlad Tepărju, for instance, did in a terrific article. Looking at how Article 4.2 and the discourse on national identity have opened the floor have opened the door, to such claims. More recently, we know that the Court of Justice itself has employed an identity language in its twin judgments concerning the validity of the conditionality regulation. But this stuff can be studied also from another perspective, from the perspective of the constitutional limits, the national constitutional limits that national courts and constitutional actors are increasingly identifying vis-à-vis the primacy of EU law. This is not new. Since this dynamic can be traced back to the constitutional conflict that already occurred in the 1970s, of course. And there is a third perspective that I will focus on today, the mobilization of national constitutional law against EU law primacy, seen as a deliberate political and legal strategy. In this sense, the Slovak and Hungarian amendments are not just exceptions. They are not deviations. They reveal how national constitutional law has become a privileged arena for the articulation of liberal politics, and how the language of national identity, originally conceived as a mechanism of accommodation within the Union, consider the very important points made by Bogdan and Schild in their seminal article published in the Common Market Review, how this device has been repurposed to challenge the very foundation of the EU legal order. So in light of the above, my research question is the following: how do populist movements mobilize national constitutional law against supranational integration? My argument is that the populist movements have a deep interest in constitutional law. Indeed, they seek to incorporate it into the political playbook, using constitutional law arguments to consolidate their power and legitimize their claims. Why? For at least two reasons. First of all, because by using constitutional law arguments, populist forces try to gain a semblance of reputation and respectability for their agenda. Secondly, because it is easier for them to present themselves as defenders of their national constitution than as mere opponents of European integration. And I'm going to come back to this point in a moment. So against this background, the European Union actually is frequently portrayed as a part of the enemy, as an intimation of a transnational elite, especially by governments that combine populism with a strong sovereignist agenda. For the purpose of this talk, I use mobilization to describe how constitutional law arguments are converted into the political weapons to be used for strategic ends. When populist forces use national constitutional law, they frequently construct what I call my words, constitutional counter-narratives. By constitutional counter-narratives, I refer to the cherry-picking and instrumental use of constitutional law arguments, and I'll provide some examples during this talk. Now, this phenomenon is very diversified. The uses of constitutional law against European integration vary from country to country, across the political parties, and over time. Its target is often the EU, but it can also be linked to criticisms of other international organizations, such as the Council of Europe. In some instances, it is coupled with formal proposals to withdraw from European organizations, while in others, this element, at least on paper, is absent. Despite these differences, it is possible to identify some common traits that tend to be present in most instances of this populist constitutional counter-narrative. And these features can be identified at three levels. At the theoretical, the constitutional level, for them, the only existing demos is the national one. And any other that approaches rejected as a falsification. In these populist forces sometimes borrow from important scholarly discussions, of course, instrumentalizing these scholarly strands. At the level of judicial politics, they attack supranational courts seeking to mobilize national political and judicial actors against them. And at the level of party politics, we also look at analyzing the manifestos of many political parties for this book. In their manifestos, populist parties use the prestige of constitutional terminology against European integration. Now, in this, the constitutional counter-narratives, the demos is understood only in an exclusionary manner. Identity is understood as a sameness, so as something static, something rooted in the traditional values of a country. And this deflects an instrumentalization of moral, religious, and historical arguments drawn from tradition. Now, when I make another caveat, for me, identity is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, they understand identity as a whole, but we know, relying on what philosophers have written, that identity can also be understood as a mirror, as a bridge, that connecting different elements, different entities. So I mean, there's something dynamic. So I'm not blaming identity as the cause of that, all right? Finally, sovereignty is presented by these populist forces as a unilateral claim only, as we will see. Now, the EU is seen as a mere external constraint, to what we in Italy call the vincolo esterno. So I mean, something affecting conditioning. The conditionality is a key word, and Matteo has written a lot about that. Something conditioning the national democratic process. This is precisely the argument that populists use to claim that the EU functions as a dispositif, à la Foucault, as a device of depoliticization designed to constrain national democratic processes. For them, the only possible democratic arena is the national one. The EU is seen as something completely detached from national democracy. It is seen as a vampire sucking the blood of our democracy. Of course, in so doing, liberal populists deliberately omit, and that's why their constitutional counter-narratives start cherry-picking, right? So they deliberately omit the added value that European integration brings to national democracies in terms of protection of fundamental rights, and this is something that also the UK Supreme Court explicitly admitted in the Miller saga. But also in terms of new remedies, think of the importance of the semental mandate, especially in those systems that are not characterized by a judicial review of legislation. The UK, but also the Netherlands, of course, right? New forms of checks and balances, not to mention the possibility of regulating transnational economic phenomena and actors. Populist forces argue that the coexistence between national constitutions and EU treaties is impossible. Impossible coexistence is a formula frequently evoked by champions of sovereignism in Italy, and I could mention many examples. So I mean, they take sides in favor of national constitutional supremacy, and the primacy of EU law as developed by the Court of Justice is considered as a constitutional aberration from their point of view. Now, should we accept these constitutional counter-narratives as legitimate uses of constitutional law language? I have my doubts for different reasons. First of all, because the way in which the constitutional law arguments are used by these forces contradicts the core of post-World War II constitutionalism in Europe. In other words, their counter-narrative does not pass the comparative law exam. Populist movements present the constitutions and the EU treaties, but this applies, I mean, to international treaties in general, it's impossible to reconcile. But this is a false dichotomy, since one of the characteristics of post-World War II constitutionalism is openness, and Alejandro Cesar-Knights has written a beautiful book in this sense. So openness seen as a bridge to connecting domestic law and international law. Openness is one of the most evident features characterizing this constitutional text, and it is possible to find the roots of this phenomenon even earlier. Looking back at what in the 30s of the 20th century, Boris Mirkin-Dertsevich called the internationalization of modern constitution. Now, since post-World War II constitutionalism has rejected nationalism, seen as an expression of the totalitarian ghost, in this post-World War II constitution, sovereignty is not only seen as a shield to protect national interests, as something that can be triggered unilaterally. Sovereignty is seen above all as a key to participating in multilateral international organizations. And this explains why these post-World War II constitutions are so rich in clauses that deferring to international human rights treaties, seen as a reaching factor, as well as the provisions allowing for limitations on sovereignty. So as we know, especially at the beginning, also the community law benefited a lot from these constitutional clauses. Also, populist constitutional counter-narratives tend to ignore or flatly deny what the EU treaties actually say. The Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union codifies some common values. These values are not intended as ethical guidelines. The Court of Justice has clarified this in its case law. But they are rather multi-sourced equivalent norms, as a public international lawyers will say. So norms aimed at defending, protecting some common constitutional goods and belonging to different sources and different levels. In this sense, Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union establishes a sort of presumption of a structural compatibility between national constitutions and EU law. Bogdan has written a lot on this concept. So against this background, interpreted disagreements over those shared values are certainly possible, and they can even create productive forms of dialogue. I've written elsewhere on the good consequences, sometimes at least, of a constitutional conflict. But the confrontation and conflicts fueled by an abusive mobilization of constitutional law arguments are different, because they are deliberately stoked to undermine common values, hollowing out not only the core of the EU legal system, but also betraying the national constitution that populist leaders claim or pretend, perhaps, to defend against the EU. A case which is emblematic is the Hungarian one, and I could cite other cases as well, but I want to focus on this 2016 ruling of the Hungarian Constitutional Court on asylum seekers, among other things. I mentioned this ruling because it paved the way for the approval of the constitutional amendment that we mentioned at the beginning. The amendment deferring to the necessity to protect the constitutional identity and Christian culture of Hungary. And this judgment also represents the first in a long series of cases in which constitutional theory and constitutional law are used to challenge supranational obligations. Let's look at this constitutional counter-narrative in action. So the Hungarian Constitutional Court first invoked the concepts of constitutional identity and sovereignty, seen as intertwined, to justify Hungary's non-compliance with the values of Article 2 and with the principles of Article 6. In this judgment, the Hungarian court understood Article 40.2 in a completely decontextualized manner. It isolated paragraph 2 of the norm, completely neglecting paragraphs 1 and 3 of the same norm, referring to the principles of confederal and the principle of sincere cooperation. So it used that Article 4.2 to defend sovereignty, evoking a term which is not even mentioned in the wording of Article 4. And you can also see here the Misolange argument that taken in a, again, cherry-picking manner from the German Constitutional Court case law. Notice also how the Hungarian Constitutional Court in this passage defined EU law as a mere international treaty. And that's, of course, a downgrade, a diminution for those who believe in the special nature of EU law. So this cherry-picking interpretation of Article 4.2 creates a constitutional counter-narrative. Indeed, in so doing, they instrumentalized Article 4.2 to justify the impossible, something that the Court of Justice case law does not permit, violating the values of Article 2. So in conclusion, populist forces use national constitutional law to create constitutional counter-narratives that attack the fundamental principles upon which the EU and the national constitutional systems are based. Of course, the populist use of constitutional language does not always lead to this outcome. However, when populists undermine the presumption of structural compatibility between national law and EU law, we see the abusive nature of their instrumentalization of domestic constitutional law argument. This approach is not only challenges the special nature of EU law, but also legitimizes attacks from the core principles of post-World War II constitutionalism. Conversely, when that constitutional core is not contested, we may be dealing with a non-abusive instrumentalization of national constitutional law arguments. But even in such cases, the phenomenon remains problematic from the perspective of EU law only, since it implies a legal clash with the principle of primacy and generates legal uncertainty. So in cases involving the abusive mobilization of constitutional law arguments, populist movements seek to transform integration through law into disintegration through constitutional law. And this dynamic reminds me of the parasitic logic described by Nadia Urbinati and Benjamin Arditi in their studies on populism. So concluding, and that's my punchline, I promise. Today, rather than calling for withdrawal from the EU, illiberal populists are preaching its disintegration from within. Thanks indeed for your attention.
Thanks so much to both of you for your very impressive and thought-provoking presentations. Now it's time for the coffee break, and then we'll have the chance to listen to Eleanor Sharpston. Thank you so much. Okay, now it's the time for the presentation by Eleanor Sharpston. We are really thrilled to have you here, and she's gonna talk about populism, freedom of expression, and the rule of law, some unanswered questions. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I prefer speaking standing up. I'm a small woman, and if I sit down, I get lost.
It's fine.
It's fine. Much better. I mean, I want my hands free. But thank you. So being the last speaker at the end of an intense day and a half of very rich discussion is always a challenge. And obviously the colleagues yesterday initially set the framework for the analysis, diagnosing the populist challenge. And then we had the focus on the Strasbourg Court, the ECHR, which was examined yesterday afternoon. And my two colleagues this morning have already given two complementary, very detailed, very thoughtful perspectives on the view from Luxembourg. Now, let me tell you what I'm not going to do. I am not going to add a third elder statesman, former Advocate General analysis of my former court's response to the populist challenge. And very sadly, unlike my brilliant younger colleagues, I do not have my very latest research that I'm eager to present to you and tell you all about my new book that's just about to come out. I'm delighted for them that that is happening, but sadly I'm not in that position. So, what am I going to do? Well, what I'd like to do is to try to stand back a little bit and with very simple words, take stock of the issues, and in doing that, I would like to try to open the way towards the final debate, because the final debate is really meant to be interactive. It's not meant to be the panel giving you another version of what they think. It is really meant to be the opportunity for an exchange. So, I have three strands in my title. I have populism, I have freedom of expression, and I have the rule of law. I will be asking of each of those three strands 3 questions, 2 in the discussion and then 1 right at the end. And those questions are focused around 3 very simple words. No isms, no abstract nouns. The first word is what. What is the essence of each of those strands? The second word is why. And why covers 2 things. It covers why is this happening? It also covered why does it matter? Put slightly differently, why do the essential characteristics of this strand rub up against, create friction with those other strands? The final word, which I begin to talk about in my very imperfect conclusion, but I hope we'll do better in the debate. The final word is how. How should we be going about reconciling these 3 strands? You will already have noticed I'm not clever, I don't have a PowerPoint. I have no visual aids, I just have my own rather slow voice, because I honor my colleagues who can speak English so fast, but I cannot. So this is the speed you will be getting me at. Now, I do warn you in advance, I do not have some magic recipe that I'm going to produce at the end. I do not have a magician's hat out of which I will pull, hanging by its ears, some jurisprudential rabbit and say, here is the rabbit. Look, beautiful rabbit, white ears, big rabbit, magnificent. I have no rabbit. My more modest objective is to invite you to think, invite us to think collectively about what is going on when populism, freedom of expression, and the rule of law collide with each other, and what do we do then? So, let's begin with populism. What's the essence of populism? Well, others have already had a go at providing much more learned and scientific definitions. If I were to give you a layman's definition of populism, it would probably be something like the following. Populism is a political movement that bases itself on particular popular sentiments, and it proposes simple, soundbite solutions to the concerns being expressed. It's a layman's definition, but maybe it serves some purpose as a working definition. Now here's a layman's focus on some of the observed characteristics of populism. I think the starting point tends to be a sense of grievance. We are being left out. We are being left behind. We cannot get decent jobs. We cannot get houses for ourselves and our sons and daughters. We cannot get a decent education for our children. We cannot get swift access to health care, and you can fill in the rest of the list. So, what is happening is terrible. We're not getting what we're entitled to. And what is worse, the material good life is out there. We can see it on the television screen. We can see it in the incessant consumer advertising. It's being dangled in front of our noses. Look, the beautiful new clothes. Look, the lovely new iPhone, right? We can see it, but we are deprived. We don't stand a chance of getting our hands on it. Now, please note that some of the grievances, some of the identified problems about not enough housing, good education, good healthcare, decent jobs in the regions, some of those grievances may well objectively be justified. There is no point in worrying about populism without thinking about why it happens. If the grievances are justified, my friends, we need to address them. We and our political representatives are democratically elected holders of legislative and executive power. We need to address the underlying problems. I go back to my analysis of the observed characteristics. So we have a sense of grievance, we're being left out. That means that, in one sense, we have both a sense of entitlement, we are entitled to have all these things, and we have a sense of victimhood, an indignant sense of victimhood. And of course, if I'm a victim, well, that must be someone's fault, someone else's fault. It's not my fault that I'm a victim, but someone else is doing me down. And therefore, you get the identification of an other, a group of individuals, a group of people with a particular identifiable characteristic. They are stealing what we should naturally have and what we are entitled to. So, the solution is obvious. We need to deal with them. I mean, we need to stop them claiming benefits. We need to stop them claiming the wealth that should be ours. We need to get rid of them out of our body politic. What are they doing there, these other people? And, by the way, they're pretty horrible people anyway. I mean, they're other. They're not like us. They're different culture. They came into our country. The old cartoon, if they're working, they're stealing our jobs, and if they're not working, they're stealing our benefits. You know, either way, they're wrong. So, if they're horrible people, it doesn't matter getting rid of them. And this is often coupled with some charismatic strong man or strong woman, let's not be sexist. That person is wonderful because that person being there and talking to us in nice, simple, clear, short sentences, that person means that I, as a citizen, do not need to take responsibility for heavyweight thought. I just need to follow the leader because my leader has a vision and all will be well. Does this remind you, my friends, of anything that happened in the 1930s? It reminds me of it, and it sends a very cold feeling down the back of my spine. By the way, this can also be combined with rage at surrendering our values to foreigners, to foreign hegemony, to foreign legal instruments, or to foreign courts. We were reminded very helpfully of the Slovak Amendment. Think of the wording we were looking at on the screen. Why does all this matter? Well, I suggest there are 4 aspects of that. First of all, it is a wonderfully oversimplistic analysis of problems that are usually very complicated. Secondly, we pin blame for those problems on the other, whom we are free to demonize. Thirdly, we are liberated from existing formal or legal or moral constraints on taking it out, on taking vengeance on that other group. And of course, the fourth, and the references that you were making, the use of constitutional lawfare, that is, warfare conducted through law. Useful word, lawfare. The use of that is an integral part of this approach. If we can use lawfare in other areas, of course we're free to use it in this area as well. And how nice to be able to wear the clothes of our national constitution in order to further the populist cause, rather than merely appear to be against European integration. Let's move from there to freedom of expression and start thinking about the essence of that. I mean, can we, should we, put to one side those like US populists who argue that the right to freedom of expression is absolute? Is it absolute, or is it confined by something? Well, there was a ruling of the US Supreme Court that burning the national flag, the Stars and Stripes, is permissible because it's an expression of one's view. The current president of the United States is very much in favor of freedom of expression, but he has just signed an executive order that makes burning the flag illegal. So freedom of expression, not so absolute. If we're looking at this from either an ECHR perspective or an EU Charter perspective, I think we're more used to thinking of freedom of expression as a right that is very important, but that has natural boundaries. And those boundaries, we seem to have a consensus that some verbal freedom of expression is not okay. Hate speech is not okay. Incitement to violence is not okay. Speech that demeans the victim is not okay. We seem to agree on that because that seems to go through to those values we were reminded of in Article 2, TEU. So why do we reach that conclusion? I suspect it's because, as a precondition, we accept that the victim, the target of that freedom of expression, has rights that should be protected. So is the recognition of particular rights with which those victims are endowed the clue to triggering an examination of the limits to freedom of expression? And the other side of that coin, if we decide that those categories of people do not have rights, gay rights, same-sex marriage, non-traditional family values, fill in your favorite. If we decide that they don't have rights, well, then it's obviously they don't have rights. It's okay to move against them, isn't it? Or is it not? I guess this also begs a further question: what am I using my freedom of expression for? Am I using it for my own cause? Think about the suffragettes trying to get the freedom to vote. Am I using it against your cause? Am I using my freedom of expression against migrants, against people seeking international protection? And what about the proportionality of the state's response? How far should the state intervene if you are going beyond the limits of what we, society, thought should be the limits to freedom of expression? The next word is, of course, why. Why does it matter? Well, I'm going to put this very simply. because unfettered exercise of freedom of expression, particularly if it is allied to populist objectives, has enormous potential to do really serious damage. And there is a disturbing tendency, and we can see this in many places, to think that violence falls within the range of acceptable responses to political disagreement. I'm just thinking of the recent marches in central London with people chanting Tommy Robinson's name. And I was watching that from Luxembourg at a safe distance. I was looking at it through a television screen, and I felt very uncomfortable, and I almost felt physically threatened by seeing what was going on. Now, we also, of course, live in the brave new world, don't we? We live in the brave new world of social media and social media influencers. And that allows influence using freedom of expression at the cost of very little personal investment, very little personal danger for the person making the speech, putting forward the incitement. I wonder a little bit, this is an aside, I wonder a little bit whether perhaps there are some parallels to be drawn here with the increasing use of remote electronic controls to wage actual warfare, where you, quote, neutralize, close quotes, the enemy by hitting some kind of little trigger button, sitting behind an electronic screen 3,000 kilometers away. It's not so in your face and personal as being an individual soldier with a bayonet and you kill the other guy or he kills you. I just wonder. So then you get all sorts of issues, maybe we'll go to them in the debate, on what happens on social media platforms, using the language of warfare. Politicians frequently do, don't they? And when that crosses the line to suggesting violence is okay, plus dehumanizing the opponent. If your opponents are vermin, it's obviously okay to exterminate them. And a little warning at the end of this section, a warning to those who would like to exercise unfettered freedom of expression because they believe that their cause is noble. Moral certainty as to the rightness, the correctness of my view can be dangerous. It can be dangerous because it can blind me to the impact that my actions may have on you, and it may falsify the assessment of the value of our relative rights. So be a little bit careful about moral certainty. It leads to interesting places. Third section before the conclusion, rule of law. Oh dear, am I going to try to define rule of law to an audience full of lawyers? I think that might be a little bit risky. I suppose if I were going to try to say something, it would be, okay, rule of law is a rules-based system for ordering society that's applied impartially, justly, and fairly, and that society covenants, the society agrees it's going to respect. Lord Bingham, Tom Bingham, produced a big definition of the rule of law in 2006 and said that all persons and authorities within the state, whether public or private, should be bound by and entitled to the benefit of laws publicly and prospectively promulgated and publicly administered in the courts. And he then went on to write an entire book on the rule of law, of course. And in that, he expounded and he developed 8 principles: accessibility of the law, law not discretion, equality before the law, how power should be exercised, Obviously, the protection of human rights and fundamental rights, dispute resolution mechanisms, right to a fair trial, and the idea that a state should respect the rule of law in the international legal order. So if your country signs up to an international legal instrument, it should respect what it signed up to. It sounds so simple put like that, doesn't it? Now, that sounds all very well, that sounds all very fine. Why does it matter? Did I just say, why does it matter? In a room full of lawyers, I said, why does it matter? All right, I know. For lawyers, that question may seem entirely superfluous, OTOs, redundant. Because to quote a very dear friend of mine, whom I admire greatly, Professor Daniel Sarmiento, he's known to many of you, I know, and Daniel once beautifully said that the rule of law should be part of the DNA of every lawyer, and I respectfully and entirely agree. But in the present context, we do need to ask the question, why does it matter? Why should society, in particular, those who feel that they are being unfairly excluded, they're being shut out, they're being not heard, why should they buy into the system of the rule of law? If we want them to buy in, we'd better have a good reason. Maybe the reason is that the alternative is the breakdown of democratic values-based society as we know it. So then we need to explain why a democratic values-based society is actually rather important. Perhaps the answer is that sooner or later, those who are pulling down the house will be shouting for workmen to come and prop up the roof. When their rights are affected, they're going to reach out for that law and say, look, I have that right under law. Law, protect me. Courts, protect me. Rule of law, protect me. So, to wrap, so that we can get on to the debate, how are we going to go about reconciling these three strands? Well, dear friends, I've spent my entire professional life working as a lawyer. So very naturally, I am going to say to you that the rule of law has to underpin the answer because it enables values to be upheld. And if we no longer think that legal rules matter, we are in big trouble. I'm going to remind us all that there is a lot that is within the eye of the person looking at the situation. There is a very old joke that you look at somebody and you say, that person is a terrorist. And I say, no, that person is a freedom fighter. There is a lot in the perspective of the beholder. I don't have a magic answer. I'm going to fall back on the standard lawyer's answer. You obviously have to look at each situation very carefully on its facts. You need to look at the parameters of the legal instruments that society has put in place. And it was very helpful to have the exposition of moving from reactive to proactive. Part of that is also we can't just look at the Court of Justice or the Strasbourg Court to give us answers. As somebody who used to serve in a court, but there are others who have that honour, I will point out the obvious truth that a court deals with what's on the court file. It deals with what's on its docket. But a court does not go out and initiate the proceedings that lead to a judgment. People have to bring it to the court. No magic answer, but looking at individual facts on the basis of a very careful, a very meticulous analysis, we have to decide whether freedom of expression or some other important right should prevail in a particular case. We need to decide whether there are justified grievances behind populism, which have to be addressed by democratic politicians. I'm really sorry, but when you say have to be addressed, I'm afraid the next words are money, followed by investment, followed by taxes. But they probably have to be addressed, these issues, because if they're left to fester, to go bad, they will become a breeding ground for populist poison. So what we do need to do is look carefully. What we need not to do is we need not to be distracted by irrelevant elements which really aren't part of the main story. We need not to be satisfied with some very shallow view of what has just happened and reach for an instant solution and judgment and solution. And I'm going to finish by saying, I think we need not to go for really sexy three-word sound bites. As somebody with a British passport and a British accent, I'm going to conclude by reminding you of a big soundbite that turned up in 2016 in the context of a certain referendum. The three words were "take back control." And we all know how well that one ended. Thank you very much.